On behalf of the county, Canaan Associates and DPZ Co-Design, good evening and welcome to the fifth meeting of Series 2 of 3. My name is Marina Corey. I'm with DPZ and I'm joined by Matt Lambert and Mike Wyke. And from Canaan, we have Eliza Juliana who's with us, as well as many more from the county, including Alberto, Olin, Marcos, and Greg. All of these folks will be helping answer questions during the two Q&A pauses we're going to have today. As a reminder, Series 1 was an introduction to the comprehensive plan and particularities of each of the 6 market areas. It provided detailed references about each area of the county to assist us all in better celebrating the general character and individuality of each area. It also touched on strategies for growth based on what areas in the market area will generally be maintained, what areas will evolve, what areas will transform, and what areas can grow, and how that growth should be shaped. As a follow-up, this series is an introduction to sectors and place types, 2 technical terms you're going to learn a lot about today, and they are intended to further guide growth in a more predictable manner and in a way that supports the mayor's initiatives, as well as what we have been hearing many county residents want and support. The last of the Series 2 meetings will take place tomorrow. Series 3 in late spring is about the zoning code, which describes the zoning regulations intended to support the policies that will help guide growth, development, and areas of conservation. So we look forward to your active participation, collaboration, and engagement with this team as we collectively map and describe the ways in which the county should grow over the next few decades and what that can look like. A few housekeeping rules before we begin the presentation. So this meeting is being recorded and will be available for viewing on Vision 2050. It's also being streamed live to the Orange County social media website. Attendees may ask questions through Zoom using the Q&A button and through the Orange County Facebook within the live stream comments. And we'll make an attempt to answer as many of those as possible. As I've mentioned, these meetings focus on those 2 primary topics, sectors and place types that Matt will describe. Future meetings will cover additional comprehensive plan topics as well. And lastly, we ask that those who are attending on Zoom stay on after we finish the presentation to take a very short survey that'll help us with the feedback that you provide us with tonight. So on that note, I'd like to turn it over to Alberto Vargas, the Planning Director.
Thank you very much, Marina. I am excited to be here tonight. I hope you are as well. Thank you very much for your time, everybody who's participating, and looking forward to the extended discussion this afternoon. As Marina defined at the beginning of this presentation, this is the 2nd series of town hall meetings, and we're looking into the details of how we're positioning the county to continue to plan for the next 3 decades. And you're part of that. We cannot arrive to a specific modification of planning strategies, principles, as well as policy without your very important involvement. This is a slightly different way of looking at planning, and looking at it from a different lens is what we're intending to do here than the way that we've been planning for the last 30 years in Orange County. We're putting right there in the center and core of this conversation how important context diversity is as we continue to look at the strategies here. The diversity of the county from every aspect, from topographical conditions as well as the diversity of lifestyles. And that is also very important about today's topic in the rural East Market area. We started with the market area approach, 3 different scales of planning, from the macro approach at a market area scale, not only to help us organize the way that we are engaging the public, which identifies 6 general areas of the county with its overall diversity within each one of them, but also the market area approach helps us conduct and organize the goals, objectives, and policies of the comprehensive plan as well. The sectors themselves, as you'll learn quite a bit more about today, tonight, will set the overall vision map, if you would. Areas that are generally delineated that will help determine the county's policies of those areas that will develop a certain way, will redevelop a slightly different way than it may be today, or areas that may stay pretty much the same as they are today. So we will see how the delineation of those sectors would help guide the future of the county, and also the type of places that would be developed within those sectors, the character that's intended for those places, the mix of uses, if any, and the level of density and intensity of the type of places that exist would be modified, or new places within the sectors themselves. We looked at the last 2 weeks now, and we started this second series back in March 22nd, last Monday, with the South Market area. We've been transversing Orange County and the residents as we engaged this second layer of conversation with the second town hall meeting series. We're here today, March 31st, to discuss the rural East, everything east of the econ, about 259 square miles, more or less, of area, and approximately about 34% of Orange County. So quite a bit ahead of us tonight. Appreciate your time. I am going to just check before I turn it over to Matt Lambert with DPC, if there are any commissioners that have joined the meeting tonight. And I see District 5 Commissioner Emily Bonilla is with us tonight, and I would like to give her an opportunity to provide any welcoming remarks. Welcome, Commissioner. Thank you for your time tonight.
Hi, I don't know if you can see me. I'm on my phone, but I did want to say hi and thank you for being here to everyone who's participating. I know that this is definitely the area where all of this kind of started with the grow and the controversy of that. Mayor Jacobs and staff was like, we have to do something and make sure that we're proactive. So, that's when all of this got started, and Alberta has been very active and diligent in it, and I'm so happy to see this moving forward. But this could only happen with the participation of the people, so I'm very happy that you're participating, and please continue. I believe there's going to be another one, and there's just a lot of opportunity for you to have your voices heard. If there's any additional questions or things that you need from me, I'm here, I'm available. And I'm also starting a neighborhood council, so if anyone wants to get involved with that, just reach out to my office and let me know as well. That first meeting will be coming soon, hopefully in another couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Looking forward to further dialogue as well tonight. Matt, I concede the floor to you. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Alberto. We'll talk about some general things, and we'll also get into a lot of specifics in the rural East. So this is a little bit of a mixture of both. It's important for everyone to be able to interpret the maps and the information that will be coming out through this comprehensive plan process, so that you are able to participate and provide feedback as best as possible. So in this case, again, we're focusing on part of the picture, and we'll have some more meetings to dive into other details later on throughout the year. In the last town hall series, Marina had mentioned that there was a lot really addressed, a lot of complex topics to frame what a comprehensive plan is. Many in the public don't know what a comprehensive plan is. They don't interact with it regularly. And many topics were covered in that last meeting series, such as how much the county will grow, what the generational dynamics are of growth and aging, the formats within which growth may occur, what is it that affects housing affordability, and whether people have options for transportation, where some places are more connected to regional transportation options than others, new mobility technologies, the current state of planning, and so on. So if you didn't see the last series, they're available on the Vision 2050 website. Please watch those videos. This market area, others. It just helps put more of the comprehensive plan in context for those who are not as familiar with it. So quite a lot must be considered in a comprehensive plan. There's a lot in there because it looks forward into the future and coordinates the activities within the county and policies across different departments. So this comprehensive plan, Vision 2050, is obviously looking 30 years into the future, 3 decades, and that's quite a long time. So 6 times that ago was 1840, sewing machines were the new thing. And the last 30 years, quite a lot has happened, especially in technology, from the early personal computers and in homes that could afford them to advanced computers really everywhere in our pockets, our wrists, our cars. On Mars, it's about to take off with a helicopter if that hasn't already happened autonomously up there. So, where we go in the next 30 years, quite a lot could happen. And the comprehensive plan here is designed to take a look towards that distant future and align as many policies as possible so that the activities of the county can be coordinated towards a shared vision of the future. Orange County itself is a hotbed of innovation. There's a lot that goes on in the county, and it's also home to a diverse and growing population. And we're going to talk a lot about growth and growth management today. And when we look at growth management, we have to consider how to grow as a county, because growth is happening, while also protecting sensitive natural lands and the county's rural heritage, to grow in ways that increase equity and affordability, mobility options, access to jobs, and places for friends, family, and of course, fun. There's lots of that in the county too. Now, as a reminder that this was spoken about the last time, the prior comprehensive plan that's currently in place was adopted in 2009. Comprehensive plans are updated and rewritten on a regular basis. That's really the point, to revisit all the policies and direction and realign with where the future is heading from this point forward. So the Vision 2050 plan is also going to have quite a lot in there. But one good trend that's been happening in planning and policy is to really make these issues more friendly and accessible to the public in general, and to assure that we set clear expectations for the future. So today we're going to focus on growth and development policies and the way that Vision 2050 can lead the county towards a future vision, and hopefully something that's more accessible to the public in general than, say, prior plans and policies. So growth, a major component of this, and we're talking about growth management, is really the population projections. Here's a population from 1970 to present and a projection forward. The county has really been growing pretty steadily. The chart's almost linear. And so at the end, you can see the yellow line continues that rough linear trend. And that's where we're projecting there about 690,000 additional people if that linear trend continues. But of course, there's a cone of uncertainty at the end. You don't know, maybe it's a little bit less, maybe it's a little bit more. Either way, that's a lot of growth. 690,000 people is a lot of growth, a lot of new neighbors. And in relationship to the county, it may be easier to understand, say, the population of Orlando. The city has a population of 280,000 people. So the county projection is for growth by 2.5 times the population of Orlando. And this was even before more recent trends have seen population increases recently in Florida. So the higher end of the cone may be a possibility. So from a growth standpoint, to think that growth would occur evenly across the whole county, that's just bad planning. And to allow growth to occur evenly across the county would also be bad policy. That would degrade the quality of life, increasing the amount of time people have to drive, increasing the cost of infrastructure and the tax burden associated with maintaining roads, and reducing the rural and natural lands, a concern of particular importance in the rural East. So I hope we can agree this is not a desirable outcome. So we're looking at planning, and we plan in order to direct growth to specific places, not everywhere. And one of the 2 components of growth management in Vision 2050 are the sectors. Sectors direct growth to where it's encouraged. But we can also plan in order to direct the character of new development, in those places where growth is desirable. When we consider the county as a whole, it's quite a diverse place, and it should continue to offer people a diversity of options for a way to live, diverse job opportunities and educational choices, and diverse ways to get around. In Vision 2050, place types direct the character of future growth through form, intensity, block structure, civic spaces, the mix of uses, and mobility. So these sectors are large, and the place types fall within them. And together, these two constructs direct growth towards a future vision that we hope is more clear and accessible. Where growth occurs and the character it takes is a key component of Vision 2050. These live in the future land use component of the comprehensive plan. Sectors determining where growth should occur, and place types determining the form that growth will take. And most people don't interact directly with the comprehensive plan and future land use. So hopefully by clarifying this and striving towards a clear and understandable Vision 2050 document, and listening to you and having your contributions towards the vision, we can build clear expectations for what the future should hold. So we have predictability. Predictability is really important for all of you to have confidence in these documents and in the future. Here's a larger overall picture that the sectors and place types fit into. There's a lot of terminology that's used, and so I just wanted to go through some of these elements so you're at least familiar with what they might be. At the top, there's incorporated municipalities. We'll talk about that a lot in the examples today. And the incorporated municipalities within the county, they determine their own policies and goals. So we map them. We'll talk about the overlap between them, and the county coordinates with these municipalities in terms of shared goals and shared policies. But really, it's the municipalities that set the goals for growth and growth management and the subject matter we're talking about today inside of their boundaries. Next are the market areas, which Alberto mentioned just a few minutes ago. And they were discussed in detail in the prior meeting. These are really tools that allow us to zoom in on different parts of the county that have specific characteristics, to analyze those places, engage with people who live and work there, and to consider how policy should react to different contexts. Then we have the urban service area. You in the rural east are all very aware of this. It's a policy boundary that determines where utility services will be offered. It's really an indirect growth policy, since we're talking growth management, in that it limits where growth can occur from an urban versus rural standpoint. And then the following three elements are the subject of this meeting and the following series 3 of the meetings: sectors, place types, and then the zoning code update, Orange Code. Those three work together very tightly to control the intensity and form of growth. So today we're looking at sectors and place types. Again, we'll look at Orange Code the next time. And we're going to first do the sectors and then take some questions, hopefully related to the sectors principally, and then move on to the place types and jump into questions related to those. So trying to break it up into 2 sets so that we can really absorb each of these concepts. So sectors, again, determine where growth should occur. They also determine the amount of growth in each area through which place types are applicable. Technically, they're limiting the applicability of the place types by an area, and those place types are future land use categories. We'll look at these after the sectors in specific, but to understand the sectors, it's best to think about them determining where growth is directed. These are the 6 sectors in Vision 2050 on the left, and that little thing on the right is saying incorporated areas are not included in the sectors, right? So we'll see that a lot as we go forward. At the top left is a targeted sector. This includes the areas where growth is actually a priority, where growth is intended. Well, intended is the next one, where growth is really a priority, growth is targeted. The next sector is the intended sector, and this is where existing area-wide plans have already been developed and adopted, and where existing plan developments have been approved and entitled. These 2 sectors are where nearly all future growth is directed, the targeted and intended. Following these are the established sector and the rural sector, retaining their current character in general. These areas may see a small amount of growth, of more natural growth, but in general, growth is discouraged compared to other sectors. And then the preserved sector is for very large and contiguous preserved natural areas. Of course, there's large amount of this in the rural east. And at the bottom is a special sector for these more complicated land uses like power plants and water treatment facilities, airports, and universities, these places that have to be really considered one by one on their own. So here's how they break down in land area across the whole county. The vast majority of the county is within the preserved, rural, and established sectors. These are where significant growth is discouraged. Instead, growth is directed towards the targeted intended sectors, roughly 12% of the county overall. And we'll look at it specifically in the rural east. But here's the overall county in chart form. You'll see incorporated areas and roads. Roads are here because when you sort of add up all this ground, the road rights of way actually are a lot of land. So we lump them in incorporated areas, and we're talking about the other land uses. So the incorporated areas and road rights of way occupy a large amount of the county, right? But the preserved and rural sector occupy a little bit more than the incorporated areas and roads. That's, you know, the vast majority. And then areas prioritized for development in the end, in the targeted and intended sectors, these are really a small percentage of the county overall. So we'll take a closer look at each sector. First, the areas where significant growth is discouraged, and then areas where growth is encouraged. This first set is on the county overall, and then we'll zoom into the rural east. So here's a map of the whole county. We'll see how sectors are mapped at the countywide level here. Incorporated areas cover about 24% of the county. We've only labeled a few of the incorporated municipalities here just for orientation and legibility. If we put them all on the map, you couldn't read it. But as I mentioned, these are areas that manage their own growth policies, and the county coordinates with them for future growth and policies. The sectors apply really to the unincorporated areas only. The first and simplest is the preserved sector. These are lands currently in preservation or with policies directing for future preservation. The sector includes only large and contiguous areas in preservation. While many developments have additional smaller conservation easements, they're not part of the sector. So here's the preserved sector mapped. Overall, it's about 21% of the county. The rural sector includes lands that are in agricultural use, rural settlements, large undeveloped lands where growth is discouraged, and natural areas that are not yet in preservation. Here's the rural sector map. Like the preserved sector, the rural sector covers about 21% of the county, or most of this, of course, is in the rural east. The established sector includes most of the county's residential areas with a goal to maintain the current character. This is the established sector mapped, which are residential areas principally surrounding and between incorporated areas. And this includes about 13% of the county overall. If you add these together, you can clearly see the areas where growth is discouraged, comprising 55% of the county. And of course, we're excluding the incorporated areas, which set their own rules. So I've thought this paradigm made a lot of sense. I've got a 6-year-old, and there's this healthy eating strategy being used today of go slow and whoa, encouraging kids to eat lots of healthy foods, the go foods, not to eat too many processed foods, the slow foods, and to very rarely eat sweets and treats, the whoa. We can look at the sector map in the same light with the whoa areas where we want to discourage growth in general, like the preserved and rural sectors, and slow areas like the established sector. And next, we'll look at the go areas. First is the intended sector. This is a go area that includes places already in, and that is before the Vision 2050 process. These are areas that have already been planned for new growth, including entitled plan developments and area-wide plans. The sector represents about 5.5% of the county, including areas like Horizon West and Innovation Way. And you can see most of this is really in the Southwest. And then lastly, the targeted sector. This is where most new growth will be directed and encouraged. The sector includes existing commercial, industrial, and higher density residential land located along the county's major roadway networks and along its future planned transit routes. Here's the targeted sector map, representing about 6% of the county. This is really the growth priority area. The targeted sector is heavily concentrated in the I-4 corridor and the South Industrial area, as well as on major roadways leading to and from the incorporated areas. Mapping along the major roads, the targeted sector is closely tied to future transportation planning That's a coordination of land use and transportation. It's a sort of planning ideal that's often discussed, and this is fully embedded in the direction for Vision 2050 and in Orange Code, and together these are the types of planning documents that the Florida Department of Transportation's new context standards are really oriented towards. So these work together. So together, the intended and targeted sectors where growth is encouraged, these are about 11.5% of the county overall. And then lastly, there's the special sector. Like I said, places like UCF and the power plant, the golf center, things that aren't really normative. So together we have a full sector map of the county, and that directs where growth should occur and how much should occur in any given area. And at this scale, it's hard to determine individual areas, but we'll look at the rural east specifically in a moment. But first, if you think about the go slow and whoa approach, the sectors are fairly clear constructs from this perspective, really directing where and to what extent growth should occur. So let's zoom into the rural east market now and see, how do the sectors map out here? Well, incorporated areas, none of the rural east areas fall within incorporated municipalities. So the comprehensive plans policies really apply everywhere. So here are the preserved areas, 37% of the rural east. These are mostly along the edges of the market area. And I put these boxes up here because it's always surprising to see what 40%, 37 is basically 40% looks like when you consider an overall area, and that percentage is located at the edges. It's a substantial amount, but when it's linear, like along the St. Johns River, on the map, it can feel like it's less than it really is. So, look at the two boxes, and you can see that where 60% is on the edge, it doesn't look like very much comparatively, but where 60% is in the middle, it really looks like quite a lot. So just maps can be a little bit deceiving in terms of when things are spread out or concentrated. So here's the rural sector, and that 60% was in relation to this. About 60% of the market area is mapped with the rural sector. And again, with the boxes, because this area is concentrated in the middle, it does feel like it's most of the market area. But in any case, a majority is in the rural sector, which is a low growth area aimed at preserving the existing rural character. As a whole, preserving the rural east rural character is important for the county overall, and not only the rural east. Established, well, right now there's no established sector in the rural east. And I'll note a few times actually that that these maps are in progress, and we're taking input and having discussions, and in the next few months the maps will be provided to the public for review on the Vision 2050 website. So be sure to pay attention to that and go to that site to find surveys and help us shape this mapping exercise. But you'll hear me talk about some trade-offs. We can map it this way or that way. And so here's an example. Right now, no established sectors. Currently, the existing rural settlements fall within the rural sector, and they'll be preserved along with that sector. But really, these are of a, it's because these are of a lower intensity at present than the established sector within the urban service area. So they're categorized as rural. If we categorize the rural settlements as established, which they sort of are, that might signal a desire to increase their intensity, which we don't want to see happen. So at present, the rural sector is really where these settlements make sense. And so that's why you'll see they're not really called out from a sector standpoint, because we don't want to signal that there's something like inside of the urban service area. So together, the preserved and rural areas cover 96% of the rural east area. Really, 96% is pretty incredible. And of course, this clarifies why character preservation of the rural area is so important here. So let's look at the remaining sectors. The special sector, that doesn't really exist in the market area, though there is the area of large county facilities, that special sector along the western boundary, just to the west of the regional preserve. In the growth category, the intended sector covers 2% of the market area. These are areas, again, within existing area-wide plans or plan developments that have been entitled already. Of course, the GROW is one of these, as is Sunbridge. These are already entitled and mapped as intended in Vision 2050 because they've been adopted. This reflects decisions made prior to the process. And all the intended growth areas occupy very little of the market area today. And this is also reflected in targeted sector. There are no targeted growth areas in the rural east market area. A small portion of the targeted sector is mapped in the east market area along Colonial, where this meets the rural east up to the urban service boundary. But within the rural east, there are no targeted growth areas. In total, the growth areas in the rural east include only the intended sector, already approved growth, which totals 2%, far less than anywhere else in the county. And that really reflects this goal of preservation in the rural east. Where from a go slow, whoa standpoint, here's how the sector map breaks down. It's really all about the whoa here in the rural east, more so than anywhere else in the county. If you look at some of the maps that we've made for the other meetings, there's much more mix between where growth is encouraged, where it's slow, and where it's discouraged. Existing entitlements do allow for some rural growth, of course. So it's on the edge, the rural area is on the edge of slow and whoa, but those entitlements are quite restrictive, so we describe it as a whoa. And from a sector standpoint, this is a composite sector map. It's pretty simple here. It's much more complicated in other market areas. But we wanted to review this overall to provide as strong an understanding we can of sectors and how sectors apply to the rural east market area. But we'll quickly tee up why we use these constructs. And for the most part, the structure is aimed at the urban service area where land is much more complicated. So not so clearly applicable in the rural east because it's fairly monolithic, but in the rest of the county, there's a lot more interaction between these. And you'll have access to the maps to look at them and comment. And so you should be aware of how these structures work for the county overall. Currently, future land use in Orange County is generally a reaction to existing uses. And it must be changed if, say, an office building were to be converted to housing, for instance. It's unstructured, meaning that there's really no rules to the current system of future land use. And as a result of having no clear rules, it's unpredictable. With sectors, as we've investigated so far, and place types, which we'll talk about next, both levels of planning provide structured rules aimed at a predictable outcome. These are planned at the scale of an area, not property by property. And as a result, it's possible to determine if future changes to the future land use would make sense or not. The sectors, they influence place types, establishing the first structure, and then place types direct zoning and the built outcomes. And we'll clarify that. So again, in the rural east, these layers are not nearly as important as they are elsewhere because it's essentially all preserved or rural. Yet you can still benefit from the predictability that place types and sectors bring. But before we move on to the place types, we'd like to see if there are any questions so far from attendees or viewers or items to add by the county or the consultant team. Marina?
Thank you, Matt. You spoke about predictability being key, and I think it's hugely important in this particular area, which has such a directive for preservation rather than growth. And obviously, I'm looking at the questions and I can see people are upset by the development allowed in Westfield. Now, Westfield is indicated in the rural sector, and then the historic traditional settlements, rural settlements, are also in the rural sector. Can you speak a little bit to the fact that we want to encourage one type of pattern and discourage another type of pattern? I think it's safe to say that Wedgefield is not the kind of pattern that's going to be encouraged here.
Yeah, and that's why I brought up this. Do we mark it as established? Because it's clearly not rural, and that's again mentioned. Why some of this conversation is happening is that many patterns, recent patterns of rural settlement have not been rural in character. They've not reflected preservation of the rural landscape and rural environment, and those are not encouraged into the future. We'll look at an option when we get into place types for what, if anything, growth could be in the area, but in general, we know that those patterns are not desirable patterns going forward. That's loud and clear. Totally agree. The only reason that we didn't say mark them though as the sort of established to call them out as something different is because they're a little bit lower density than, say, what the established sector is inside of the urban service area, and so they're kind of a special thing. And so instead we call them out as a special place within the rural area, but not a place that, in the policy, it's a place that is not to be expanded, not to be added to.
I think
so they're restricted as such.
I think you'll explain that more when we get into place types, but why wouldn't it be as an intended sector if it was originally done as a PD?
Well, those places, if you're talking about Wedgefield, it's already developed, right?
But
as opposed to the Grow. Now the Grow is a more recent version of that, and that's in the intended sector because it's a PD not built out entirely, and but it's been approved. So because it's been approved, we said here's the intended sector. But as you may have seen in the maps, the intended sector is only mapped over those things that have been approved before now, which is saying no more of that. The rural character preservation is key. Now we'll look at should there be any additional growth or not additional growth, and if there is, what format does that take? But we sort of call out here's the stuff that's happened to date in terms of these plans and PDs as something very different from what should go should be the future of the rural East.
So Alberto, I may ask you to comment a little bit on this too, because I'm seeing questions and comments from people saying Wedgefield is growing faster than 2%. They're seeing builders rip out trees by the hundreds, and clearing is happening by the acres, many, many, many acres. So obviously the land area is 2%, but the amount of housing that's coming in is obviously more than 2%, since so few homes are actually being built currently in the rural East area. But do you want to comment a little bit on the history of Wedgefield and what will not be replicated moving forward? Alberto?
Sure, Marina. So Wedgefield is as described, a very unique area. It has different densities even within the overall community. The majority of it is alluding to, general very large parcels with an intended what used to be a historical large acreage within each one of those units that exist within Wedgefield itself. On the northern part of Wedgefield, however, it's a little bit more traditional, if you would, or suburban in character. It's a very mixed urban composition of development patterns within Wedgefield, and it has a golf course within it as well, so that is intended to be preserved and as an active golf course community surrounding it. So you can see, from the community of Wedgefield, like 3 specific different patterns that are in play here. The reality is that as we look at the rural East market area, we look at the necessary services that are needed for communities to continue to develop at the rate that we anticipate the rural East developing, which is very different than other market areas as described or as presented throughout this series. We need to again continue to focus on development patterns in terms of areas that may be suitable for a much more sustainable type of places, a much more sustainable type of community than what may otherwise be considered to be sprawl from a growth pattern. So if we focus on what we have heard from the residents already about the preservation of the sensitive natural lands, to grow responsibly, and to continue to create those places that are unique to the diversity of the lifestyles in Orange County, we need to continue to be true to those specific principles and which one of those are applicable to the different areas. So even though there may be opportunities for much more defined growth, even in the rural East Market area, we need to understand that existing built out communities that residents live there because that's the lifestyle that they are after. We need to continue to embrace those, continue to preserve the character. I heard a comment about tree canopies being affected. We're trying to be very specific and much more predictable about preservation of the very important tree conditions as development continues to happen within the county and within the different market areas. So again, Wedgefield, very unique community, very diverse within its boundaries, but it is pretty much established, even though you may not be in the established sector.
Got it. So you think it's better indicated as established or rural rather than intended? Because it sounds like the development's still going on, but you would know best.
Yeah, pretty much. You know, I think established as we are continuing to define established neighborhoods throughout the rest of the market areas, I think Wedgefield would perhaps qualify under the established sector and not necessarily just as under the rural sector itself.
So, you know, now may be a good time to say, while the mapping and the physical form that the county will evolve through this mapping of sectors and place types is an important component of the comprehensive plan, but there are other policies and objectives too that are going to guide growth in ways that aren't necessarily related to the building envelope, for example. And so I'm seeing a lot of comments here that relate to people saying that animals are being displaced in Wedgefield. There's clearings of very large lots. Dirt is being moved. The ecosystem is being disrupted, and they obviously don't want to see more of that. And I think there's general agreement that this is one of the reasons why this comprehensive plan is moving forward the way it is that development pattern has been acknowledged to be unsustainable in the rural East area. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Alberto, other than I'm also seeing comments of people saying that the county has just enabled this kind of development in the past. We can't speak to the past right now, but we can certainly speak to the future and the aspirations of what the rural East will look like.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that comment is that with Vision 2050 and the collective effort of moving forward is that Orange County, at the level of this town hall meetings and the amount of feedback that we have received thus far, and the premise of why we're here tonight is really not to be reactive anymore, not to be just processing applications because the development community has presented them without having a roadmap, if you would. And again, once Vision 2050 is adopted, hopefully the clarity of that roadmap to better understand the places that should develop a certain way, should redevelop another way, or should pretty much be preserved, is going to be mapped in a very much more predictable manner, and move away from this reactive type of review process that we engage ourselves. You know, predictability creates value to the communities. Predictability creates a much more serene environment for those residents that live in areas that they understand their future as to what may happen in their environs.
Yeah, and I think Matt, when he gets into the description of the place types, will be making that quite clear. The For those folks who are commenting on the fact that they live in Wedgefield, sorry, and they know the area well and they want to be consulted, please rest assured that you will have opportunities to review these maps and get involved in marking them up. And we'll speak to that a little bit later as we move forward. So one other question before we move into the next segment, which is an interesting one. And essentially, it's implying that the intended areas, such as Innovation Way, are inadvertently going to create problems with unintended growth in areas such as Wedgefield because of the price point being less than the intended areas. So what are the plans to discourage that and control the unintended consequences?
Is it growth or sort of displacement by price?
I think it's
because
the price is so much more attractive in certain areas by virtue of the fact of where it is, that it's encouraging development in Wedgefield that wouldn't necessarily happen if it was going elsewhere. But I do think that the targeted sectors and the whole way in which this comprehensive plan is being laid out is going to clarify that and help direct growth to certain areas, whereas it didn't before.
Well, that leads to any of the affordability discussions that we've had in prior meetings, which is to affect that, we need growth. We need growth to keep up with the population. We need growth to provide for the housing that is lacking today, and the housing types that are lacking today. And most of that is intended to be absorbed in those targeted growth areas, which can occur at a higher intensity, which can absorb housing types that are not just single family, but duplexes, townhouses, small multifamily, larger multifamily buildings, mixed use, and in a format connected to transportation and jobs, education, to try to fill those gaps and absorb as much of the demand as possible. But to deal with growth and the demand for growth, you need to provide for the growth. And if you're not providing for the growth, then prices elsewhere keep going up and up, and growth will continue unchecked in areas where you want to control it.
That's right. There's a question here, and I think we know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it to Alberto anyways. Is there a limit on the number of building permits issued per year in the rural East area, or it's whatever's been approved and that's it?
Yeah, there is no limit in terms of the permit.
Okay. All right. So there's two other questions. The first one, well, hold on, there's actually a couple more. Orlando can't handle more density. Do you know that we can't? Orlando actually can handle more density, and it's being directed in very specific ways. I mean, more people, as you saw by Matt's numbers, 700,000 people are projected to move here. So hopefully they will be directed to the targeted areas. There's lots of opportunity in the intended areas, which are in various areas of development. And of course, the established sectors, not necessarily, we're not talking about the established sectors in the rural East, because that's not the case. Those are the rural sectors. But in established sectors within the USA, there's opportunities for what we call very gentle intensifications of density that are in keeping with the character of the single family homes that are there. So, and of course, part of this comprehensive plan effort is to ensure that parks and services keep up with the anticipated level of development that comes. So I'm answering that one question. But the last point I'd like to make before we turn it over to Matt to really speak about place types, probably more thoroughly in this meeting we have in others, because we are attempting to introduce other patterns of development, sustainable rural development patterns, and we're very interested to know how the community feels about it and if it resonates with them or not. But there's one comment here, Donna Ginther, who's interested in the commissioner's offer to join her committee. So we would like to just remind her that she should get in touch with the commissioner's Commissioner Bonilla, staff, and they will they'll figure that out. So that's for Donna Ginther. And the last question is what's being built on 50 where the scrapyard was, and the county staff is looking into it, and we'll wait till after the next segment to answer that question a little more precisely, unless Olin or Marcos is ready to answer that now.
We have done a little bit of a quick research on any pending application regarding the question here on 50 scrapyard, and we didn't find any pending application from a rezoning perspective. So whatever is taking place right now would have to be comply with the existing zoning the district of that particular parcel. Most of them in that area are C3, so whatever is allowed would have to comply with those regulations.
Great. And so Matt, before I turn it over to you, again, lots of comments on the retention of the biodiversity, the retention of the people upset that certain gopher and turtle nests are being impacted negatively. So I hope that when you speak a little bit about the place types, and in particular the rural ones, you can emphasize the difference between the natural environment taking precedence over the built environment in places like this, and how the criteria for development can begin to be more impacted or more described in a more detailed manner with respect to the preservation of natural habitat.
Yeah, it's the right time now to influence the policies that are put in place in these sectors to give to respect as much of the the natural biodiversity as possible, in understanding of the trade-offs with the growth that is occurring, whether we want it to or not. And that's sort of the case everywhere. And on the statement of Orlando not being able to absorb growth, there's quite a lot of the county that's been urbanized so far that is very that has been urbanized in a low intensity manner and in a relatively inefficient manner. Like the number of different parking spaces that are provided for every household, for example. Every household has a parking space in 5 or 6 places. And there's just a really inefficient way that the city and the county has developed, to date. And there's a lot of opportunity to change that pattern. That's what a lot of the goals of Vision 2050 are, to change that pattern so that it can function better with transportation, so that the areas that have been urbanized previously can absorb more of that growth. It is at a higher intensity than it is today, but it can absorb that intensity given the land use. But if you don't do that, then the result is more growth in the rural and natural areas. And so that's the trade-off. So while we're talking, especially in the rural East, about what the patterns of growth here are, they're very much affected by the patterns of growth within the urban service area. And by directing growth in those areas, you can preserve as much as possible in the rural area. So the two are tied, hand in hand.
Great. So moving on to the next.
Let's jump into the place types. First we wanted to talk about sectors because the sectors determine which place types should be allowed in a given area. Some place types are of a greater density and intensity, and others of a lesser density and intensity. The targeted sector, for instance, what we're talking about in these infill areas, that encourages infill and permits place types of a higher intensity than, say, the established sector, which aims to maintain the character of existing neighborhoods, or the rural sector, which aims to maintain the character of the rural landscape. But place types aren't only about the density and intensity. They determine how growth can occur through physical characteristics, heights, block structure, civic spaces, mix of uses, and along with density and intensity that are normally part of future land use. Many place type details are regulated in the zoning code update, Orange Code, and we'll discuss that in the next series. But in the comprehensive plan, place types are the new future land use. They regulate density and mix of uses, the allowable mix of zones in the zoning code, and they also describe the character of new development tied with other goals and policies. See, the structure of market areas and sectors and place types also allow you to attach policies that are specific to that type of area or that specific area or that type of development, rather than broad policies that are not really well suited everywhere. There's a lot of things, where we're talking about some of these issues with trees and biodiversity, and there's areas where that's already been impacted, and those should have a different set of policies associated with them to areas where they haven't been substantially impacted and require a greater degree of preservation. So, but in place types are organized into 4 categories. There's the urban place types; these are in the urban service area. And the rural place types, these are outside of the urban service area. There's open space place types, these cover natural areas and parks. And then special place types, which are kind of like the special sector, special areas for universities, industrial districts, theme parks, utility districts, and so forth. So we'll go through this in the order of relative simplicity. Open space first, it's the simplest. There's 2 types, parks and recreation and natural areas. Both types can be located in any sector. And you'll notice here some dials on the right-hand side. These are just to help you compare one place type category to another in terms of the relative access to transportation that they tend to provide, the relative density, and the relative preservation of landscape in the area. Now, parks and recreations, these cover the larger county parks and recreational facilities. Again, they're in any sector. Many are there today. There are new ones with new development. There's new ones following the parks and recreation plans. These are really intended to enhance the surrounding area, but pretty clear and easy to understand. As are natural areas. Natural areas are places set aside for conservation. Of course, the preserve sector is full of natural areas, but they're also found in other sectors. A natural area may not be part of the larger preserve sector, but it's still in conservation. And so the place type for natural areas is for preservation, whether it's within or not the preserve sector. And then we'll look at the special place types. These are pretty simple in concept. Just like the special sector, these types don't fit into the urban or rural category, but they're key components to Orange County. These places require special rules and special consideration. So here we gave 3 examples: industrial, institutional, and entertainment place types, while a few others exist in addition to these, like airports and utility facilities. These are the sort of places that aren't typical development of an urban or rural nature, but very sort of specialized places that need special attention and special rules. So now we'll look at the rural place types. These are of particular interest in the market area. We'll follow with the urban ones because they're still the most complicated in terms of structure. But the rural types, we'll describe them in a little more detail in this meeting than we have in prior ones, because they're really of importance to the rural east. So the rural place types we've divided into 3 categories, and they're within the rural sector. They're all low density or very low density in character, with landscape and the preservation of the rural environment and regional character as the goal. You're familiar with the rural lands and rural settlements, which we'll talk about. And then there's the place type at the top of the list, which is a proposal for consideration, as Marina had suggested, and we'll explain that in greater detail than the others, because the others you should be pretty well familiar with. So in reverse order, the rural lands are really those areas that we think of when we consider the rural environment. They have little development or no development, and they're principally agriculture, pastoral, or in preservation. This is what you really tend to have in mind when people say rural. Currently, these areas are extremely limited from a growth perspective. And we know that there is some ability to grow, at 1 unit to 10 acres, but there's other restrictions on them. These should be a pretty well understood type, and they're in a lot of places in the rural east. Next is the rural settlements. These are the existing developed areas in the rural landscape, as we were just talking about. In general, these are intended to be preserved and not expanded in any way beyond, what is already approved or planned prior to this process. So not intended for growth or expansion, but clearly identified for preservation of current character. So, okay, finally, there's the proposed third type. This is rural villages and hamlets. They're walkable places within a rural landscape surrounded by land in rural use or natural areas. Today, these don't really exist yet, but they're proposed as a potential solution to the whole growth struggle. Rural villages and hamlets as a type could allow for some growth, but with very strict rules to preserve rural character, to preserve biodiversity as discussed, to preserve natural areas. At present, there's a strong no-growth stance, and that's been built recently, but those positions change over time. One way or another, over time, large property owners will continue to ask for entitlements, and they'll ask for exceptions to the no-growth rules. So the rural villages and hamlets option is a proposal that provides an avenue for some very slow and limited growth, so that when entitlements are pursued, as they will inevitably be, this provides a set of very strict rules to point towards, rather than an open-ended negotiation that could result in growth that's out of character with the rural landscape, as you've seen to date. This may or may not be accepted as part of Vision 2050, but we wanted to put it forth as a consideration for a trade-off of where strict rules could be set ahead of time now, rather than reacting to requests for entitlements and exceptions in the future. So the current proposal is aimed at managing a small amount of growth, but without sacrificing the overall rural character. Prior attempts at clustering, of course, in the county haven't worked out well. So instead, you've ended up simply with more average quarter-acre housing subdivisions, and they tend to expand the urban growth into the rural environment. Those don't fit. And rural environments are also not simply about large 10-acre properties. That isn't rural either. Miami-Dade County, for example, has divided nearly all of the Redlands, its rural area, into 10-acre properties, and the rural character is gone. The rural environment is really defined by wide pastoral areas that are unbuilt, and the hamlet and village proposals suggest that a very large minimum property size may be required to begin with before even thinking about growth, and that only 20% of that property can be built on. The remaining property is either preserved in a conservation easement or is zoned with one of the new rural zones in Orange Code of, say, 1 unit per 25 acres, getting out of that sort of standard 10-acre or nothing, neither of which is rural. So inside the 20% developed area in these cases, higher intensities may be allowed, though with strict standards aimed at absorbing some growth while preserving the open land around. So in this case, the hamlets shown at a 30-acre minimum parcel size, maybe large or larger, only 20% of that is developed, 70% in preserve or reserve, and that 10% that's in between, 70 and 20 is 90. You have open space and parks and streets and things like that land in that area. So we've written these types of rules elsewhere, and we've learned from places like Scotland and England. This is in DPZ's practice, where rural environments have long been preserved. And we've studied the potential trade-off for Orange County, strict rules that aim to preserve rural character. The image here, this shows a collection of English villages and hamlets that have large rural areas preserved between them. See, it's the spacing out of settlements and the preservation of large areas of rural environment between that preserve that character. So the hamlet is the smaller of the two types. Here proposed at a minimum of 300 acres or larger, and hamlets restricting development to 20% of that land area. And then, as I said, a minimum of 70% in rural reserve or preservation. The hamlets also can be tied to other standards. A suggestion that we've had is to space them a minimum distance from adjacent roadways so that you retain the rural character that's along county routes. Now, the village is the larger of the type, requiring at least twice the land area, 600 acres as proposed to date. Now, unfortunately, this drawing, which was done a little while back, it only shows a 300-acre site, and the actual area needed for a village would be twice as large as shown here. So we drew this village at the 300 acres and found that as a result, the minimum site should really be larger, as clearly this is not enough preservation. But being a proposal, these types of standards are up for modification. And so, we draw it and see and say, well, we really need more space for a village. But like a hamlet, the village would allow only 20% for development and 70% in rural reserve or preserve. And at the minimum size of 600 acres, it's 420 acres remaining rural or natural, in preservation. So a little more development would be permitted in terms of number of units, but the land area is larger. And since villages can provide some services useful to others in the rural environs, they could potentially touch the roadway, but not really occupy the entire edge. So this type of development isn't just a theory. We're building villages and hamlets in Scotland and England right now. It's all about the rules that are selected. And right now they can be selected ahead of time rather than in reaction to a proposal down the road. And the format isn't just a foreign concept. Rural areas in the US have seen compact development preserving rural and open lands. But again, it's all about the rules. And to date, the rules haven't been written in such a way that you end up with that outcome. And we'll look at an example later that'll help put it in context. But again, the village and hamlets proposals aimed at preserving large areas of the rural environment while permitting a small amount of careful growth. In both cases, limiting any development to only 200% of the overall site, 300 acres or above, 70% preserved. So we recognize that any such proposal would need to determine a viable means of utilities. But if the proposal is one that could gain support, then that's something that could be worked out and a potential way to preserve rural character in the face of growth pressure. And as we discussed, if you don't allow any growth, then prices go up, and it's this overall balance. So we're aiming for as much as possible within the urban service area, within the targeted sector, but there's a lot of growth heading this way, whether anybody likes it or not. But today the line may be held at no growth, but that may not always be the case. And the villages and hamlets are a potential way to set rules now that could be strict to preserve rural character into the future. And we'll look at that in an example on the ground here after we go through the urban place types. But next we'll get into the urban place types. And these are the more complex of the place types, and that's why we save them for last. And we'll give you examples both of the urban and the rural conditions shortly. The urban types, again, are aimed at mainly the targeted sector, but targeted and established sector within the urban service area. So the urban types are a little more complicated because they're divided into 3 categories: centers, corridors, and neighborhood fabric. Each of those has 3 types with them. That's so 9 total. It's a lot, but it's not that much for future land uses. Of these types, centers are the most intense. Centers are all mixed use, and they're at the higher end of density relative to other place types. The corridors connect centers, and they're also mixed use, but a lower density and intensity than centers. And then neighborhood fabric surrounds centers and corridors, and that's generally residential in use along with schools and other supportive services. This is a typical diagram to illustrate the structure. Centers typically located at the intersection of major roads. They're intended to be mixed use and vibrant places for the future, places for higher density and the convergence of mobility options, as well as places for jobs and entertainment. Today, these are mostly shopping centers that are along major roads with big, huge seas of parking, but they'd be encouraged to infill with housing and additional non-residential uses, usable civic space, which are plazas and squares and outdoor spaces that aren't just sort of open space dribbled along the edges of the development, but really meaningful places to gather, and with the aim to become vibrant places. The lowest intensity of the centers is the neighborhood center. These are small areas that may be non-residential today, they may be mixed use, but they tend to just span a few blocks or, a slightly small area, but areas where the compatibility with adjacent neighborhoods is important. So many of these exist today, and they're intended to be enhanced and encouraged in the future. So the ones that are single use may be supplemented with some housing, but not a significant amount of growth in the neighborhood centers compared to the other types of centers. The goal here is compatibility in terms of scale and activity with the neighborhood fabric surrounding. The urban and regional centers are the more intense of the place types, typically associated with mixed use, like the image. These are split into two. Urban centers is the lower of the two intensities. These buildings in urban centers may be 3-4 stories high on a connected street grid, mixing non-residential and residential uses. They're places for entertainment, services, job centers, and places that, there's actually a good amount of people that want to live in this type of environment, but currently they don't exist in the county, not in any quantity anyhow. And so this is part of the sort of absorption of growth issue. There are places that are in demand that are not in, that have no supply. And so people end up moving into environments that are not ideal for them. Some people like a suburban context, some people like a rural context, and some people like an urban context. And you have a lot of the suburban and rural and not much of the urban. And so, but there's a lot of opportunity for infill. The other center type is the regional center. These are more intense, like downtown. So an additional regional center is planned for iDrive, and that's intended to become a key destination for the region. But both of these centers, they concentrate density and intensity to build places that are active and vibrant, but they're also key nodes in a future transit network, the type of development that transportation needs, whether it's bus or any other type of transportation, to really be efficient. And they're also in the ideal types of environments for other mobility solutions, micromobility, bikes. These really work better in well-connected street grids where there's a mixture of uses. The corridors connect the centers together. They're generally along transportation routes, and they provide housing and also non-residential in an area that has transit access. Corridors are generally mixed use. Typically, it's about adding residential uses to places that are commercial today, but the intensity and density is much lower than the centers, and being adjacent to neighborhood fabric, corridors must transition in intensity towards the surrounding neighborhoods. And that happens both at the place type level, being a corridor, and in the way that zoning manages transitions. And the smaller of these is the Main Street corridor. They're low scale and low intensity. A lot of them that exist today are single use, but they could absorb some housing. But corridors also benefit from a look at the street and how the street could benefit from changes in coordination with the Department of Transportation, Public Works, and so forth. Adding street trees, finding places for on-street parking, slowing down cars. These are things that corridors can help manage. The Main Street corridors, of course, like this, really need to benefit from a street that interacts well with the land uses along it. And in the comprehensive plan, I had mentioned much earlier that there's a coordination with the State Department of Transportation and future land use. And both are aimed at making places more walkable and bikeable, and as a component to the DOT's context-sensitive approach. So between the comprehensive plan and Orange Code, the goal is to coordinate there with FDOT and the county's transportation departments to coordinate land use and transportation so they work well together. Transit corridors is another corridor where this is important, located along existing and future transit routes. And because they have greater transit access, they're intended to be higher density and intensity than the Main Street corridor, mainly connecting people to transit opportunities. They're mixed use in general, but they may not be that mixed use. You're more likely to get more housing than housing and non-residential in these corridors. And the primary goal really is to increase the population living along premium transit routes and to increase ridership in the end and reduce future traffic impacts associated with population growth. Centers, of course, play a key role in that too. And finally, there's the suburban corridors. These are located along major arterials that will remain car dependent. Suburban corridors may be intensified with some mixed uses and beautified, but their relationship to the major roadways requires special consideration with respect to zoning and land use. For instance, in this image, without on-street parking, you can't really put the buildings to the street, but you can require a better relationship to the street, such as illustrated here. Now, the remaining of the urban place types are neighborhood fabric, and that makes up nearly all of the established sector and also much of the targeted sector. Neighborhood fabric is principally residential, along with some supportive services like schools. The lowest in intensity is suburban neighborhood fabric. This is entirely located in the established sector for the most part and covers nearly all that sector. This type is pretty common around the county, and the goals here are generally to retain the existing character, improve sidewalks and improve access to parks and open space, but not see a lot of change. Suburban neighborhood fabric is entirely single-family residential with the schools, religious facilities, clubhouses, and other uses that are typical of this type of environment. Next is the suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. This is also in the established sector. There are areas that exist that currently mix single-family townhomes and small multifamily. Like the prior type, these are targeted for preservation of character, though in some cases they're mapped such that they encourage some addition of say townhouses and missing middle housing types, as have been discussed concerning natural affordable housing and are part of the mayor's initiative for housing affordability. The suburban mixed neighborhood fabric is really found where these types mix in close proximity today, and then in some areas where they can be buffers between the higher intensity centers and the neighborhood fabric, the suburban fabric around them. And finally, the last place type is traditional neighborhood fabric. This is the highest intensity of neighborhood fabric. It's still not nearly as intense as a corridor or a center. These are areas that mix many types of housing together into a tapestry of walkable blocks and open spaces. The fabric includes schools and similar uses, but also a small amount of small corner stores and cafes, very small footprint uses. The principal goal of traditional neighborhood fabric is to provide a wide range of housing options in a walkable structure of blocks, but located near centers and corridors so that there's an option of walking and not the necessity of driving for every trip. Some of the trips may occur on foot, not every trip. So here's how they all fit together into the sectors. Natural areas and parks and recreations can happen anywhere, but other place types are generally limited according to the sector, controlling the intensity of development as well as the character. The overall goal here is to intensify the targeted sector, which is almost entirely through redeveloping commercial properties along major roads and retaining the existing character elsewhere. And that doesn't necessarily mean no growth, but instead it means very limited growth at a low volume or a slow pace. So those demonstrate the place types and their intent. And let's just look at how they might be mapped. And as you'll see, we've discussed, we're working on the maps, and there's some questions that come up like, hey, well, maybe we should map this a little bit differently. And we'll be working on those in the next months and taking really some feedback in these discussions to adjust the way that the maps are being made. So first, we'll look at an example that's urban in nature, just because it's a clear example that demonstrates the urban place type categories of center, corridor, and neighborhood fabric. We use this in sort of all the market areas because it just clearly demonstrates the intent of the urban place types. So this example is where East Semmeren Boulevard connects with the Orange Blossom Trail. Some of this area is incorporated, and we'll ignore that for the moment for the clarity of the diagram. Then we'll demonstrate how the incorporated areas sort of work into this. This area demonstrates common characteristics in a lot of the urbanized county. There's automobile-oriented commercial along the larger roads, Semmeren and OBT, and there's larger shopping centers at the major intersections. But beyond the commercial properties, there's a wide range of housing, some large and small lot, single family, some townhomes, and some multifamily. Here's the sector map for the area. Most properties are in the established sector, the tan. and the targeted sectors along the major roadways, but there's also a small node of commercial north along Thompson Road. So here's a look at the boundary between the targeted and established sectors on the aerial backdrop. It's a thicker black line. In the other examples, we've made it red, just for clarity. But the targeted sector follows mostly the commercial properties along the major roadways, with the single family beyond that. Here's a map of place types for the area. We'll call out them specifically, but first we just wanted to give that outline of the targeted sector and show that within this are the higher growth types, centers, corridors, and traditional neighborhood fabric. And then in the established sector are the lower growth types, suburban and suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. These are the centers. Two of these are potentially categorized as urban centers. These are areas of commercial and multifamily that are large enough to develop a structure of multiple blocks and civic spaces over time, and they can accommodate both mixed use and higher intensity residential infill. These are in the targeted sector, of course. The neighborhood center up on North Thompson is much smaller. This can accommodate a small amount of mixed use infill, but it really needs to maintain compatibility with surrounding neighborhood fabric, thus being a neighborhood center rather than an urban center. Here are the corridors. These are commercial and multifamily properties that are located along major roadways, but they're not included in centers. In this case, and in most cases, we'll see they're planned for future transportation improvements, transit improvements, so they're considered transit corridors as a type, and those encourage more residential and mixed-use infill than the suburban or Main Street corridor. And then the remaining area is all neighborhood fabric, the majority of properties. Neighborhood fabric is divided into suburban in light yellow, suburban mixed in light orange, and traditional in the dark orange. These are differentiated by density, where suburban neighborhood fabric is the lowest density and traditional neighborhood fabric is the higher of the three, all lower than the corridors and centers. Now the traditional fabric is all within the targeted sector. So when we look back at the place type map, this area clearly demonstrates the centers and corridors framework that we discussed. The framework is also important as we look to encourage more efficient transit functionality to increase ridership within the urbanized area of the county. Transit functions best where there are nodes of mixed activity, and these are the centers, and those are connected in lines that may also add ridership and energy, along the corridors. So here's what it looks like in this particular area when you take out the incorporated areas. It's much more difficult to discern the pattern, and of course, overall encouraging growth in these centers is something that the county and municipalities need to work on together. So to plan this, however, we first look at the sectors and place type mapping over the municipal land and then remove them from the policy so that the vision is clear. A number of areas will be, a number of these areas here, you've talked about Wedgefield. In the mapping, we'll be providing that on the Vision 2050 website as it comes together in the next few months. And there are specific places that'll have additional targeted meetings to deal with specific issues. So this was a general example of how the mapping clearly follows a pattern and exists in the urban areas. But let's look at Wedgefield. What does the mapping look like here potentially? Since these are pretty quick because the rural areas are fairly easy, we've added yet another sort of urban example so you can understand the concepts afterwards. So here's Wedgefield, at least the north side of it, and there's an aerial of part of the rural settlement. The sector map reads like this. It's pretty simple. There's preserve sector covering the preserves at the top of the map, and the rest of it's in the rural sector. And then we've drawn the Wedgefield rural settlement line here as well. It's in the rural settlement, but new rural settlements, of course, as we described, are not intended to be permitted. So this marks the sort of preservation of that settlement area. For reference here, the sector is called out over the aerial at the boundary of the rural settlement as well. Again, this is really simple, so we'll look at some other examples in a moment. Here's a map of place types. You'll notice here that there's a rural center called out. And that may be part of the rural settlement place type. This is already zoned commercial today. And there's a zone in the new Orange Code that's aimed at a type of low intensity rural commercial environment. And so that could be mapped to this area. But outside of this, the remainder of the study area is intended to be preserved in existing character. This is really just expressing the existing zoning of today. So for reference, here's the same map laid over the aerial. That rural center area has a little bit of development currently, but again, it's already been zoned for commercial and is likely to develop in the future. But the Orange Code zone, and in this case, it would be T5.1 when we get into that later. That the way that zone manages property and development allowances will be very, very important for the development of those properties in the future. So again, that's sort of that intersection between the code and the comprehensive plan. But in this case, for Wedgefield, is really just reflecting the existing condition and preserving that, but not expanding it. Though if there's some other preservation policies to add in there, that's something that could be overlaid in the policy document of Vision 2050. So here's a different rural east example, looking at the potential for a hamlet. This is one of the proposed hamlet or village low growth types. This particular location isn't selected for any reason other than to be common to the rural east. We've located it, but that's not really the purpose for looking at it. The purpose for looking at it is to describe what a hamlet might be like. So this is the sector map. It's pretty easy. It's all rural. Nothing to see here. So here's a hypothetical site of 300 acres. And here we'll look at what a hamlet might look like. I think I said rural village in the prior one, but it's supposed to be hamlet. So here is a hypothetical hamlet on the 300-acre site. 20% of this is developed, and the remaining land is in rural preservation. This is intended to be nothing like the clustering that you've seen before. While still technically there's clustering here, it's a very different set of rules. And those rules are aimed at avoiding that simple expansion of urban development into the rural context, which just doesn't fit. So rather, this positions any growth that may occur in the rural environment such that it retains the landscape. And as discussed, you can tie policies related to preservation of habitat and species and biodiversity to that. Now's the time to set the rules. And as a reminder, the rural sectors, a WOA area in our Go Slow WOA maps, where any growth should be minimal, and that growth should be subject to high standards. So requiring hamlets to locate away from existing roads, for example, is a standard that that can help ensure that any development is always at a distance and that the character of the area remains as rural as possible. So here's an example from the English landscape, because the English landscape is sort of the easiest corollary. And then here's a hamlet off in the distance, separated from the road, with rural lands preserved in the foreground. So this is the type of sort of potential way that you could regulate any future growth such that you preserve as much rural landscape as possible. So once again, this is a proposed solution to be explored through the process. There's no done deals, but we're looking to find some way to direct what that future might be rather than being reactive down the road, not having written the rules in at this point in time. So since those examples are pretty simple, we'll look at another urban service area example just to help you interpret the maps when they're published. So this example is at 436 Adeloma Ave and University Boulevard, the northwest edge of the market area that's next to Orlando. This area includes a mixture of housing of various types and densities, industrial areas, and large and small commercial shopping centers and commercial retail strips. So other than the prior urban example, this one we're adding in the special place type to it. So this example is around Full Sail University for reference. Here's how the sector map reads in the area. The industrial space is within the special sector here at the center of the image. Surrounding that's the targeted sector along 435, Aloma, University Boulevard, and Palmetto, with the established sector surrounding that. You may notice on Aloma and Palmetto that the established sector abuts the roadway, interrupting the targeted sector. You know, we said targeted is along the roadways, but sometimes the established comes up to it because there's existing single family areas that are excluded from the targeted sector. So here's that outline, hopefully better to read in red, of the targeted sector laid over the aerial image with the hole in the middle, that special sector of the industrial areas. So hopefully you can clearly see the difference between the lower density residential areas outside the targeted sector and the commercial and higher density residential areas inside of the targeted sector. This is the map of place types for the area, again pointing out the targeted sector lines surrounding the special industrial area. And within the targeted sector, the higher growth types, centers, corridors, and traditional neighborhood fabric. In the established sector, the low growth types, suburban and suburban mixed neighborhood fabric. And you may also notice that the transit corridors go outside of the targeted sector because transit routes remain a core priority vision of Vision 2050. They sort of transcend the sector lines. They can exist in both. Here are the centers. You can see 4 different sizes of centers. 3 of these are categorized as neighborhood center, though the one at the bottom right might be categorized. It's sort of on the edge of being an urban center or a neighborhood center. You know, some of the decision making to be done as we map these places. You know, so their scale, you know, these other 2, the scale's pretty small, the ones on the top, and they can't develop a significant structure of blocks and civic spaces over time. However, on the bottom left at University and 436, there's an urban center because it's a very large area that could accommodate quite a lot of infill. So this can become a more significant hub of activity, jobs, housing, and entertainment, but the other 3 centers might infill at a lower intensity. Now, most of that urban center area is in Full Sail University, but they have a lot that they could intensify as many of their facilities are reusing some pre-existing suburban strip centers or fitting into that environment. So there's still quite a lot that could be absorbed on those sites. And along the major roads in between the centers are the corridors. Again, all transit corridors because of the future transportation plans connecting the centers to each other. And then the special place types, the industrial area in the middle. There's long distance greenways that are part of Parks and Recreation. And there's small institutional and educational place types that we may map as part of the fabric. They may be special, you know, those are still being worked out. But hopefully overall the intent's clear. And then the remaining is neighborhood fabric, the traditional neighborhood fabric, deeper orange within the targeted sector, the higher intensity fabric that is. And the neighborhood's fabric within the targeted sector is basically all traditional, but then outside of it is mostly suburban neighborhood fabric with some suburban mixed, where there's already a mix of different types of housing, you know, not just single family detached. So the composite map is here. There's some incorporated on the edge, but it's pretty much all an incorporated area. So the place types would be applicable. But, you know, we do this to try to demonstrate the intent of the maps, and we're starting to change the intensity of some of the colors so that you may more easily interpret the maps without having to study them too much. So we'll be building that into what's communicated later. So, you know, through this, we've covered a lot of ground. I know the place types were a lot, and especially adding detail to the hamlets and villages proposal. But, you know, the goal here is to share information about the comp plan concepts of sectors and place types so that you can interpret the maps when they're released for review, and so you can better interact with the comprehensive plan and provide feedback. So I'll leave this graphic up, which talks about, you know, the place types and which sectors they're in, and then turn it over to Marina so we can get into further questions.
Thank you, Matt. That was a good description of the different place types. And I think some people are asking, why are we talking about urban areas if we're in the rural east? And the answer to that is that while most people are joining from the rural east, there may be people from other market areas who couldn't make the meetings before the previous 4 meetings we've had. And so that's why we wanted to show the overarching place types so that you would also understand, people would also understand what is being proposed within the urban service area and how different it is from what is being proposed in the rural.
And I'd add too that you're all residents of the county and have a voice in the overall plan for the county, whether you're in the rural east or in the core. And there was that statement that was made earlier about growth affecting the cost of housing and the demand for growth in the rural area, depending upon what happens in the rest of the county. And with a lot of growth on the horizon, it's important to preserve the rural character that growth is able to be absorbed within the urbanized areas.
That's right. So I think this next question, I'm going to direct it to Alberto because it is a sort of a place-specific question. What about the very large area just south of Wedgefield on 520, in which there are plans for 300 new homes? Is that what the industrial area to the south is going to be used for? It is being cleared as we speak. Do you know anything about that project, Alberto?
I am not aware of that particular application. If anybody else from planning that is on the line that's aware of the specifics of the question, Greg or Olin, can you address it?
Alberto, I can't think of anything either, unless you get over to the International Corporate Park area. But that's closer to the end of Alafaya and Innovation Way area.
I think I spoke to Olin earlier, and he had mentioned that there was a large area being cleared because it was invasive species that were being removed following other policies to remove those invasive species. So I'm not sure if that's the area in question or not.
And I know Brightline is.
Well, we'll have to just.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's not the area that we were talking about, Matt. I think this is a little further south. So I'm not sure either. I think Greg's right, though. The only thing near that general area is the ICP, International Corporate Park area.
And I know Brightline is working on their rail corridor, but that's probably not what's drawing attention.
All right. Well, we may get back to that question if someone has additional information while we continue the questions. Here's another good question, and we haven't really talked about this. Someone is saying, what if a developer is in the urban service area and they have a property that borders a percentage of land in the rural settlement? Can they buy the rural settlement property and incorporate it into the urban service area? And apparently they can do it now, and is that going to be corrected? And I would venture to say, by virtue of the sectors, that will not be possible.
Yeah. So just to be clear, at least today, the way that we're handling all of the policies associated to rural settlements, as per the 1991 adoption of the majority of the policies associated to rural settlement, we're trying to put those aside. There is a very specific guidance embedded in the comprehensive plan today for the preservation of rural settlements in terms of the character and lifestyle that they have. They're very diverse. 22 of them in Orange County, as we know. They're very diverse in different the development character. Some of them are a lot more traditional. And the rural ambience is a lot more perceived in some than others. But in terms of changing the density within rural settlements, I'm just going to address a few exceptions that exist today. The first one is if there are existing entitlements prior to the adoption of that particular rural settlement, the development has the entitlement to continue to develop. So that should not be a surprise to anyone. We haven't seen that dramatic change since 1991. There are other exceptions in the policies today, which we're not intending to modify. And that is for those rural settlements that are adjacent to existing municipalities, such as Gotha and Clarcona rural settlements. The policy exists today that it refers to the possibility to increase the density for those parcels that are immediately adjacent to the rural to those jurisdictions that have higher density, and they need to meet 25% contiguity in order to increase the density from 1 dwelling unit per acre to 2 dwelling units per acre, and that's the maximum that would be allowed for those particular rural settlements that meet that specific criteria. So that is an exception in today's policies within the rural settlement that we are not planning on changing. The other exception that exists in rural settlement policy today is that if a particular development is proposed to bring certified affordable housing to the development program, then that particular development would be able to be increased at the maximum of two dwelling units per acre as well. But those are very limited criteria that exist today. Again, for those interested and are familiar with those, we're not changing any of the rural settlement criteria because the idea was to identify those communities, provide predictability with a very strong sentiment not to modify, not to expand, and not to create new rural settlements in the county. So Vision 2050 is honoring all of those specific criteria, specific policies, and at this point, we're not intending to changing any of that.
I think that's quite clear. We can think of the rural settlements, the existing ones, as practically a preserve rural, a combination of the two, even though the preserve is about preserving the natural environment. Okay, so here is another place-specific question for you, Alberto. East Colonial was expanded only to Avalon Park Boulevard. Before considering additional growth, will the expansion of East Colonial be a high consideration, including more lighting and sidewalks in the Bithio area? The section of road gets extremely backed up and accidents happen.
Yeah, so maybe that's a transportation planning question, and I don't know if Renzo is available on the line right now that could talk a little bit about 50 and its planned expansion and it's the segments that are being planned right now to extend to Bithlo.
Yes, thank you for the question. So State Road 50, as you know, is a state road. The Florida Department of Transportation does have plans to widen State Road 50 all the way to State Road 520. The schedule for that is tentative, but construction is tentatively scheduled to begin in 2023 or 2024. So that's the current plan for now. The project has been delayed several times, but they do have it in their work program scheduled for 2024 starting construction.
Okay, thank you. Someone's wondering how much land on 520 was sold for solar farms and how was that approved? It's going back in the past, Alberto, a little bit about how Sunbridge is going to impact the rural east area. I think we have to acknowledge what is already permitted or what has already been approved is going to move forward, but there's not going to be more of that allowed. And that's part of the reason why we're being so specific about these kinds of place types are being offered here.
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question, and I think it needs to be addressed as as clearly as possible. As we continue to understand this vision mapping via the sectors as they were introduced today, and as we continue to define those intended sector areas, and the intended ones are those particular communities, such as Sunbridge, that has already gone through the entitlement and the review and the approval process of specific policies that are geared towards a specific place type of that community, and a series of neighborhoods that are embedded within that community, and also a set of regulations that implement those policies. Those are the type of communities that are part of this intended sector, such as Horizon West, for example, the Lake Pickets as well, Camino Real, and others that would be pretty much identified in this sector. Those are the first sector plan in the state of Florida. Horizon West is also part of this. The specific boundaries are defined. They have their own specific policy about transition and compatibility to adjacencies, which is very important and critical. They tend to identify higher densities towards the center, and possibility to also identify mobility, interconnectivity, and mix of uses in some of those. Even Sunbridge and Camino Real and others are following the same type of policy. Smart planning, sustainable type of planning in these areas was part of the consideration and approval of those. Again, quite a bit of growth in Orange County. We have given our best as of today to identify the rural sector and policies of growth in the rural sector. Remember, we are beginning to look at Orange County within the boundary of Orange County. There are other counties that are beginning to influence or opine in terms of their adjacencies to Orange County as well, such as Seminole, for example, and trying to preserve their certain rural character in terms of adjacencies to Orange County and the type of developments that happens. So how are we addressing that? Well, with the adequate transit zones that identifies transition areas that are preservation of natural lands and lower densities of development. There may be other counties that have a much more aggressive densities because of sector plans, such as Osceola County. And even though we have not had a conversation with Osceola County as of yet, we can't ignore the fact that there is a sector plan also at the southern border of Orange County in the rural East Market area that may have some type of influence as to how growth will happen, remember, in the next 30 years here in the county. So we're looking at all of those possibilities, but we're trying to give it our best right now and continue to engage you, the residents, to continue to give us your best ideas and recommendations as to how the rural East Market area should be developed.
And as you mentioned, the intermunicipal coordination between different incorporated and unincorporated areas, Alberto. The one person had a question about the acres sold for the Brightline, and I'm wondering if there were any, if that had to do with planned transportation. Obviously, it had to do with planned transportation improvements, but were there acres on the east, in the rural East areas, sold for the Brightline?
Yeah, so it is an important topic that continues to be and needs to continue to be part of Vision 2050. Brightline connecting all the way to South Florida, going through the rural East Market area, landing at the Orlando International Airport with the South Terminal, a very high technology of high-speed rail. There may be other transit system technologies that are going to connect to the Orlando International Airport, or are planned on connecting to the Orlando International Airport to provide that much needed east-west and not only north-south orientation to a transit system alternative. So I think this is a pending conversation. We don't have any specific plans that we can address today, but if we are serious about affordable housing in Orange County and addressing the need to solve to the best and highest degree possible the housing crisis, we cannot not do that in isolation and not consider the transit solutions and transportation challenges that we have with housing and growth in Orange County and dependability on the automobile and the traffic experiences that we all have because of the lack of a well-planned and integrated transit system. So yes, there's right-of-way that Brightline has been acquiring in order to implement what's planned in order to connect South Florida to Central Florida all the way to Tampa.
Thank you. There's two more questions, but someone put in a comment about thank you for your time. And for those who don't know this sector very well, we know we could help because we can help identify these areas. And I want to make clear, in case it hasn't been clear, that this initiative is really being taken on behalf of the planning staff who know the area very, very well, and DPZ and Canaan are assisting you, and you guys are providing us with a lot of this information. So it is taking a village, and all of these, the private and the public firms coordinating to try assign and understand, what should be in what sector and where are the place types that exist. So there's a lot of institutional knowledge that has gone into this this preliminary mapping, but it's not to say that we don't welcome the opportunity to get community feedback, of course, into this. And
Marina, just to expand on that as well, even though the planning division is facilitating this public engagement process with the help of the consultants, as you mentioned, there is quite a bit of internal coordination as well in order to provide the data and analysis, as well as making sure that we get all of our policies rightly placed within this Vision 2050, and that internal coordination takes beyond the planning division, public works, transportation planning, EPD, who are all on the line right now. Utilities have played a very important role and continue to play a very important role at this very early stage of the process. And let me be clear about that, very early stage in the process in terms of how we're moving forward with this effort.
Great, thank you. And I think the last the last 2 points, questions, they're really not questions, more so comments. I think we started off on this note, we'll end on this note, which is people are obviously very interested in keeping the area rural, and they are bemoaning the fact that it hasn't, that when development has been allowed to happen, it has not been in a rural settlement pattern. And I think I just want to emphasize that what was shown today was a real attempt to try acknowledge that very little development is going to happen. In fact, 96% is either in the preserved or the rural sector. And so where development is going to occur, we hope that it is in a much more sustainable and appropriate level of density and development that is permitted. And as Matt showed, with a tremendous amount of preservation of open space, so that you don't get what we call rural sprawl, which is what seems to be making a lot of people very unhappy.
And I'll repeat also, the point about, why we look at the urban service area when we're talking out here, to preserve as much of the rural character as possible, really requires support for infill of the targeted areas within the urban service portion of the county. So, you may be most interested in preservation of rural character, but infill development within the core is part of rural character preservation strategy.
That's right. So on that note, right at 7:59, nearly 8 o'clock, I want to thank everybody for their participation, and I want to give the final word to Alberto or the Commissioner Bonilla, if you have any parting thoughts, and ask people to stay on for the survey.
And also visit the Vision 2050. Following the feedback following the meeting is a short sort of open-ended feedback, and then there's further surveys available on the Vision 2050 website.
Yeah, so thank you for that conclusion, everybody. And Commissioner Bonilla, if you have any closing comments, please, we welcome them at this particular point.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to the staff and for the participation. I live, if anyone doesn't know, I live out here in the rural east market area. So I am definitely on board with what everybody says, that I would love to see this area stay rural, and definitely agree that we need to encourage more urban infill in the proper areas, the proper places where it's right and makes more sense. I just say for everyone to please stay involved and participate, because it's going to be very important to have that participation to make sure that this goes in a direction that really fits what the people in Orange County wants.
Thank you, Commissioner. Again, we have one more market area meeting scheduled for tomorrow evening. That's the Southwest market area, April 1st. And we would like to continue to invite you and all the residents that are interested in identifying strategic opportunities here for the drafting of Vision 2050 applicable to this specific market area. We will follow up with focus group meetings, not only interested stakeholders, but consultants and their representatives of stakeholders and property owners to follow with very distinct and specific topics. And we will also start, when appropriate, the public hearing process towards the end of the calendar year to be able to continue to have more public participation during those public hearings. So it's quite a bit ahead of us, and we appreciate everybody's time tonight and the rest and last week and the rest of this week. So thank you again. Please stay connected. And also, just one more point. There are some surveys embedded in the web page that's highlighted on the screen. There's going to be one more that's going to be developed, and the third segment of this engagement process, the town hall meeting series number 3, as previously presented, we're going to be describing a little bit more implementation aspects via Orange Code, which is the form-based approach of the regulatory structure that will implement the policies of Vision 2050. So please join us then. Thank you.
Thank you and good night.